Hi, everybody. This is Professor Shimchak, and welcome to our legal research class, which we are calling The Howl, because we are howling mad that we don't get to spend class time with you.
We miss you guys. It's so different.
It's very boring here.
It's very boring without you. You guys are everything. So boring.
But back to our show. I'm with our guest today, Professor Corey Lenz, and the subject of today's class is administrative law. More specifically, regulatory law. Professor Lenz.
Yes.
What is a regulation?
A regulation is a rule that is passed by the executive branch and the agencies of the executive branch. And they're often used to administer and implement and provide support for the statutes and provide more details and more granular information than the statutes do that the rules actually come up and support.
Can you give us some examples of a regulation that the students would be familiar with?
Examples of regulations would be a lot of your license requirements come from regulations. A lot of your services and safety rules come from regulations. Your Food and Drug Administration is an example of a federal agency.
So like the labeling requirements
The
on
labeling
food, that
requirements
kind of
on food, that often comes as a result of a regulation.
So folks really like nitty-gritty stuff.
Yeah, real small granular details that the statutes are just too broad to actually handle all of them. So the regulations come up behind them and fill in the blanks.
So you mentioned statutes. It sounds like in order for a regulation to exist, there has to be a statute.
There has to be a statute. The regulations and the powers of the agency are all determined by statute first. So both at the state and the federal level, Congress allows the agency to come into existence, and then Congress sets the parameters and the powers of that agency or department.
So how do regulations get passed?
Regulations get, well, how do they get passed? Well, first the regulation has to be proposed. The regulation will get proposed first, and then it will get printed at the state level. For Hawaii, it gets printed in something called the Government Register. At the federal level, it gets published in the Federal Register. And during that time, there is a 30-day period where people can comment on the regulation. And then after that 30-day period closes, the regulation then gets put into a final rule. And then usually it's in another 30 days before the final rule takes effect. That final rule is also published in the Federal Register if it's a federal rule.
So are rules the same as statutes?
Rules are not the same as statutes. They're both primary law, but statutes have our higher hierarchy than the rule. The rules are subordinate to the statute, but you often have to argue with both of them when you're making your argument as an attorney. So for that reason, you have to locate both of them, and we will be teaching you how to do that.
So let's talk about the regulations in Hawaii.
Hawaii's regulations,
So
yes.
you already mentioned initially they're published in something called the Government Register.
Government Register, yeah.
And then what happens? Where are they published after the Government Register?
So after the Government Register, and they also, when they go into a final rule, they're published in Hawaii's administrative rules. Lexis is the official publisher of them. You can also find them online in Lexis and in Westlaw. They used to be published before by a publisher named
Wiles.
Right?
Yeah.
Wiles, and then Lexis purchased them. Lexis was providing the printed version and the updates to Hawaii's administrative rules, but that has stopped since 2017, and now they're actually only published online via Lexis, but then you can also locate them at the Lieutenant Governor's website for Hawaii.
That's right. So in Hawaii, the Hawaii Revised Statutes require the Lieutenant Governor include all of the proposed and final regulations on his or her website.
Right.
Would you think that's the best place for students to find regulations?
It's the best place to actually find the most current language of the regulation, also to make sure that it's the most current and also as updated as it possibly can before you submit or file anything with the courts on behalf of a client.
So we're going to take a look at some of these resources that Professor Lenz is talking about. But before we go online and take a look at these things, how would you know what agency to look at in order to see the regulation, or how would you find a regulation on your subject?
Yeah, so to locate the name of the agency, the agency will often have to be named by the statute. So when you're in the relevant statute, and if you look in the definitions for the word agency or department, it will tell you the agency or the department that is actually impacted, or that will be given the authority to implement the rules and the regulations. You can also use Google, and also with key terms, you can use your key terms and on Google see if you can locate the agency that's responsible for actually promulgating these rules and these regulations.
One other thing before we jump online. I think it's important for our students to know that administrative agencies also have courts, right?
They do have courts. The administrative agencies, they have their own court system. They have administrative law judges that actually will hear issues related to the rules and the regulations that get passed. This is because the agencies have a quasi-judicial function as well as a quasi-legislative function. The legislative part is the rulemaking. The judicial part is that you have these administrative law judges that will administer rulings and decisions based on parties who have violated the rules and the regulations of the agencies. They are not precedential, aside from being precedential on the very parties that are before the judge, but they have no precedent value in terms of influencing the judiciary and the other courts. So while the other courts, so like while Hawaii's courts and while the federal courts can consider the decision of an administrative law judge, they in no way have to follow it, even though they often will give deference to the knowledge and the expertise of the court.
So I'm a little bit confused about the path a litigant would take if they were challenging a regulation, or if they were being subject to regulation unfairly. Right. Would they end up in a judicial court or an administrative court?
Yeah, so they would actually have to, if you're challenging a agency or department's regulation, you actually would have to you would have to be in an administrative court first. You would have to exhaust those hearings and exhaust those remedies. And then once you've done that, you can then actually appeal to the judiciary and to the other courts in Hawaii's court system, and also if it's a state regulation, or in the federal court system if it's a federal regulation.
Oh, okay. All right. So that's a lot of information, but I'm sure you're interested in. Let's find some of these regulations and see what we can do with them, both on the internet and on Lexis and Westlaw. Okay, Professor Lenz, here we are at the Lieutenant Governor's website. Yes. What's the URL for this?
URL is ltgov.hawaii.gov.
And we would come here to see the most recent proposals or the most current regulations for the state of Hawaii, right?
Exactly.
So to get there, we need to go to the agency's websites. If you go to Useful Links and you click on State Agencies, all of the state departments are listed with links out to their individual websites. And on their individual websites, you'll find the links to their regulations. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you don't know what agency you're looking for. So what can we do in that situation?
So in that situation, if you don't know, you have to rely on our friend Google. And so you can Google your keyword and see if within Hawaii it'll actually bring you to the relevant agency.
Okay, so for our example here in the Hawaii regulations, let's look for employment discrimination regulations. Okay.
So we just take the key term employment discrimination into Google and see if we can locate anything relevant within Hawaii.
And still putting my phrases in quotation marks,
Right.
just like I was on Lexis and Westlaw, because that will help Google. And I'm also looking for Hawaii, and I'm looking for regulations. So let's see what that brings us. Okay, so
I think it was the plus Hawaii or the plus regulation.
oh yeah, good point. So if you want to make sure your words show up in Google, you put a plus sign in front of them.
Yeah,
There we
the
go.
Hawaii Civil Rights Commission.
Oh yeah, so here we are. See how the plus sign can help you?
The plus sign is very, very, very handy.
Yes. So we go here and we see that it's ensconced in the Civil Rights Division within the Department of Labor, right?
Exactly.
And when we get here, you have news and events and different languages provided. But if we're looking for our regulations, we're going to go to find a law, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then from this page, you notice that everything is pretty well organized and laid out nicely. And you notice that you have, within employment discrimination, you have the different subchapters that deal with the different types of employment discrimination. And what you're going to find is that when you have a breakdown like this, we taught you how to check out the definitions for a section, and you're going to see that you often have to look at multiple sections that might actually have multiple definition sections to check out. And when we scroll to the bottom, we also have the relevant statutes.
So these would be the statutes that enable the agency to make their regulations.
Right, because just like we learned yesterday, that the statute actually brings the agency into existence, and it also brings and allows the agency to promulgate its own rules and regulations, but it has to start with the statute first.
Talking about promulgating rules, there is also a section here, I guess reserved for when they're proposing new rules and posting notices of hearings. So this would be sort of the equivalent to what the government register does in print.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The exact same thing. And then for Hawaii, they call it the government register, and at the federal level, it's the Federal Register. And that's where they publish their proposed rules and also their final rules.
Okay, so I'm going to open up one of these subchapters, and I'm going to point out to our students that just like the statutes, the federal statutes, we have titles in the administrative rules.
Right.
So we're in Title 12, and each title has many chapters. This is Chapter 46. And I'm going to Subchapter 1 to open it up and show you what we find. So this is Procedures on Complaints. So if I open that up, here are all of the different sections within that subchapter. So it's a pretty big subchapter, and I'm going to start at the beginning, which is Title 12, Section 46-1. And there's a definition section, right?
Right.
So like in the statutes, at the beginning of many of these subchapters, you'll find definitions. And are they the same as the ones that you'll find in the statute, the corresponding statute?
Some of them can be, like the regulations will sometimes adopt the definition from the statute, but other times they actually will include additional terms and provide definitions for them that actually don't exist in the statute.
So it's good to check both the statute
Exactly.
and the regulations for definitions for the
Exactly.
chapter. Yeah. So at the end of each section, there is a line of information about where this regulation is coming from, or what chapter within the Hawaii Revised Statutes are authorizing the Civil Rights Commission to make the regulation,
Exactly.
right?
So when you look at that string, the abbreviation EFF is when the regulation became effective. The abbreviation AM is when it was amended, and it was amended a couple of times according to this code section or this history section. And then AUTH is actually the name of the authorizing statute that allows the regulation to be and gives it the authority to implicate the rules. So it's HRS 368-3, and then there's other statutes that are affected by regulations, and those were actually placed after the abbreviation IMP, which means that those statutory sections are additionally being implicated.
So in this situation, it's both the same, the authorizing and the implicated, but
exactly.
they're not always the same.
They're not always the same. So oftentimes in the implicated section, you'll have an entire string of a dozen statutes potentially that are being affected by just one regulation.
I see. So that's good to know that there's more than the statute that you have to look at if you have to determine the meaning of a word.
Exactly.
And from here, I guess we could go look at that enabling statute if we're at the Capitol website.
Right.
That's
true. That's Capitol website too. Right?
Yeah. But this is pretty much as far as we're going to go with the free online source through the Lieutenant Governor's site.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you would use the Lieutenant Governor's site to get to the relevant agency and to find the most recent, the most current language for the statute. But if you want to use the finding tools that are associated with the regulation or with the statute, you've got to go to Westlaw and Lexis.
Okay, so let's hop over to Westlaw. And if you already know the citation to an administrative rule in Hawaii, you can type it in the search box. And the way Westlaw wants you to type it in is HI space ADC space, and then the citation. So 12-46-1. Okay, and that brings us directly to the citation we were looking at. And I guess, we could have also searched for it as well. Right?
Could have, yeah. Key terms too would have pulled it.
Yeah, but if you already know your citation, let's go to it directly. I don't know about you, but what I like about seeing it on Westlaw is that it orients me to where I am. So I know I'm in the Department of Labor and I'm in the Civil Rights Commission.
Yeah. And you can use the table of contents too to kind of give you the context for the rest of the regulations.
So you see all of these regulations, and a lot of it has to do with bringing a complaint to the Civil Rights Commission. So when we were talking about administrative courts, this would be the procedure you would follow if you were going to bring a complaint to the Civil Rights Commission.
Exactly.
Right. So if we go down to the bottom of the regulation, we also see the authority, right?
Yep. Yeah, so the same authority that we saw on the agency's website is seen here as well. You have the authorizing statute at 368-3, and you have that the same statute is also being implicated. But again, others may have been and will be in other sections of the regulations. And then you also have the currency information for an electronic citation if you need it.
And what about the citing references up in KeyCite?
Yeah, the citing references, it's very similar to a statute. If anything has additionally come later and cited the regulation, Westlaw will sequester everything into citing references. Not as many as statutes, because the regulation is subordinate to the statute, so it's not always being cited. But when it is, you can look at the material to gather extra background and context for your law.
Okay, and I see here that they have cases and secondary sources. So these are judicial cases? Yeah,
and these would be judicial cases. If they were actually administrative cases, it actually would say that in Westlaw and Lexis, and they'd be identified as being administrative cases or administrative decisions.
Okay, so if I go back to the text of the regulation, I want to scroll down to the authority again. Let's open up the statute to see what
yeah.
the statute looks like.
Yeah. Because by going to the statute, you now have access to, when you see by the citing references, there's 235. So you have a lot more citing references that you can use to expand your research or to give you additional background information.
And when you're looking at the enabling statute, it refers you to a lot more regulations.
A lot more regulations, yeah. And so Westlaw is good about doing this. Westlaw will drop down all of the regulations that actually cite to the relevant statute. And within them, you'll find your authorizing statute and all the other statutes that are implicated. Lexis, however, does not do this. So when you shepherdize on Lexis, you will not find this same list of regulations that are citing to your relevant statute, unfortunately.
All right, well, talking about Lexis, you think it's time to go over there and take a look at Lexis?
Oh, I guess, do we have to?
Well, just this one time.
No. Okay,
All
we're
right.
going to show you how tricky Lexis can be, for regulations at least.
So you can do this on Westlaw as well, filter down to Hawaii and go to the administrative material. So here, we're going to go to the Code of Hawaii Rules,
right? And
just to show you what it looks like.
Right.
So here you see all of the titles. There are 23 titles in the Hawaii Administrative Rules, and you can search them here. If we are searching for
we'll do employment discrimination again.
Employment discrimination. Thinking that might pull up a relevant regulation.
But it actually doesn't.
It doesn't do anything for us. And unfortunately, no matter which way we try, we're not really able to effectuate a good search on Lexis for regulations in Hawaii.
It's a little strange that you're looking for regulations about employment discrimination, and yet when you use the exact phrase, it doesn't drop. It's a little odd.
We've also tried using the citation. So on Lexis, they abbreviate the Hawaii Administrative Rules, HAR.
HAR.
Yeah. And then remember, we were looking at 1246.1. So we're thinking this would take us directly to the appropriate administrative rule. But what happens is it just takes us to Title 12.
It just takes us to the table of contents.
And then you have to sort of
open up the boxes
one by one until you find,
which is crazy, section
46-1. So we can't really recommend Lexis for finding Hawaii regulations, and we want to sort of ward you away from it for these reasons.
And it also, Lexis just doesn't have the same finding tools, because when you go to the authorizing statute, you don't get the regulations in the citing references. So Lexis isn't a great place to locate your regulation.
Right, so we looked at HRS 368-3. That was the enabling statute for that employment discrimination practice.
So we're going to show you how tricky it is.
So here we're at the statute, and it doesn't tell us where the regulations are. And then if we shepherdize it, this would be the equivalent to key citing it if we were on Westlaw. The regulations don't pop up the way that they pop up on Westlaw.
Yeah. So this is where the regulations would have been in the citing sources, as they were in the citing references on Westlaw, but notice that there's nothing available.
Right. But Lexis does have one shining point with respect to Hawaii administrative rules, right?
Yeah, so Lexis has the government register, which is Hawaii's version of the federal register that gets printed daily by the federal government. Hawaii's is called the government register, and it's only on Lexis. It's actually not on Westlaw. The table of contents isn't hugely effective. It just drops everything down by month. and then you can search for it that way. So really, you have to take your key terms and search the entire register.
But you see all the different types of things that are
True.
in
That's a good way to
the government
show it,
register. Yeah. The material that you're going to find in here isn't necessarily primary law.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's all kinds of things that talk about statutes and regulations and agency action. So more for you if you are actually in practice and you're tracking particular agency actions or government actions.
Right. That's a good point.
So we can do a search here just to see what the results look like. So we're going to stick with our employment discrimination search. We're going to make it a little bit more precise because I don't want to get too many results.
Right.
So I'm going to limit it to LGBTQ to see what Hawaii is doing to protect the rights of our LGBTQ population. Okay, so what are we looking at, Professor Lenz?
So this one is actually just a media release. The government register in Hawaii will collect all the media releases by each of the agencies and the departments and publish them in the government register, along with everything else, the proposed rules, also minutes from meetings that have occurred at the departments and the agencies, and also any new public laws that have come down.
So I ran a pretty broad search, employment discrimination and LGBTQ. So if you go to all terms, because you notice you open up to the first, I guess, media release, and it's on invasive species. So if
we are not invasive species.
Okay.
We are not.
Okay. I want to go down and see where our search terms are. We can select them there, but we're lucky because we're talking about LGBTQ and employees. So this press release is about a Supreme Court brief that the AG filed back in July 2019. So good resource if you are keeping tabs on the government and holding them to the fire, making sure they're doing what they promised to do.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that does it for our online resources for Hawaii regulations.
That wraps up Hawaii regulations.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
We're going to go on to federal.
Yes.
Hi, folks. We're back in the studio with Professor Lenz.
This is so crazy. Crazy times.
So now you know a lot about Hawaii administrative law. And we'd like to talk to you a little bit about federal administrative law, which also plays a part in your research memo for this semester. So is the process for the federal regulations the same as the Hawaii state regulations?
Yeah, the process for state and federal is pretty much the same. Like Congress has to enable the agency and the department to come into an existence. They do it via statute. And in that same statute that creates the agency and the department, they provide the parameters of the rules and the procedures for that agency, and it sets the boundaries in terms of the agency acting as a quasi-legislative body and as a quasi-judicial body. Congress allows all of it to happen. So an agency doesn't do anything that Congress hasn't already said, okay, you're allowed to do.
And so we know at the state level you have the government register, and then you have the Hawaii administrative rules. In that, we're going to look at the lieutenant governor's site for the most current and proposed and final rules.
Yeah.
And we saw from our exercise that Westlaw in particular could be very helpful for finding annotations and finding regulations associated with a statute.
Right.
So what are the key publications for the federal regulations?
Yes. The key publications at the federal level would be your proposed rules and then ultimately your final rule after the 30-day period for people to make comments. That's all published in the Federal Register. And that's on both Westlaw and Lexis, and also we have it here in print in the library. And then online, you can find it at several government sites, two of which are like register.gov and federalregister.gov. You can locate them there as well. And then once the period for comments has closed and the final rule has been published, it then gets codified, so it's then broken up by subject matter, and it's dropped into the Code of Federal Regulations.
So the Code of Federal Regulations has 50 titles to it. Each title could be more than one volume, or maybe half a volume, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's
And they're colored.
Yeah, in print, they're all different colors. Every year they change color.
Yeah.
So is it an exact reprint then of the final rule that's published in the Federal Register that shows up in the Code of Federal Regulations?
They're a little bit. It's not an exact reprint. They're pretty close. The one thing that's different is that at the stage of the Federal Register, the information in the Federal Register has two pieces that the Code of Federal Regulations possibly doesn't have. In the Federal Register, they'll tell you the reason for the rule, and they'll sort of talk about the basis of the rule and the purpose that it serves. Sometimes that information doesn't get dropped into the Code of Federal Regulations. So for that reason, as a researcher, you'd have to consult both of them.
Yeah, so that would sort of be important if you were tracking policies.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
to see why this rule was proposed, why they adopted it.
Right. It's sort of like the session laws.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So the session laws in Hawaii, remember when we were doing legislative history?
Yeah.
We had to look at the session laws or the final bill to see what the purpose of that statute would
Right.
be.
It's very similar to that.
Yeah. Well, we know when we're talking about the Hawaii regulations, we learned that the administrative agencies here in Hawaii have courts, and that you would start a litigation about a regulatory matter with that administrative court. Does that hold true at the federal level as well?
Yeah, it holds same thing at the federal level. The federal level probably has more robust administrative law judges, and then those administrative law judges also come down with decisions. Those decisions again are only precedential on the parties that are before the judge. They don't, while there's deference given to them, because oftentimes on appeal, once the parties have exhausted all of their administrative remedies within the administrative courts, on appeal they usually go to the appellate courts, and while the appellate judges can give deference to those decisions because those judges have more knowledge and expertise in the issues before the court, in no way are they precedential on the appellate justices. So they can actually, decide differently, and they often do.
The way I understand it, the federal law that governs the procedure for regulations is called the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA, we like to call it for short. And in the APA, if I can read from my notes, because I'll have to, so I don't have it memorized. It's tricky. So under the APA, the scope of review allows a court to vacate an agency rule if they find that the agency acted arbitrarily or capriciously or in excess of its statutory authority, because remember, a regulation cannot exist without a statute, or if the agency acted contrary to a constitutional right, or 4, is in violation of procedures as required by the statute. So those are the 4 bases that they can disregard an agency decision. But the court can also compel an agency action that's unreasonably delayed or unlawfully withheld. So if the agency is dragging its feet, the court can order it to act more quickly. So again, we have this issue of the regulation and the statute acting in concert with each other.
Right.
And when you look at the regulation, does it tell you what statute is authorizing that agency to create the regulation?
Yeah, like when you look at the regulation, particularly when you look at it in Westlaw or Lexis, at the bottom of the regulation, you'll see the corresponding Federal Register, and you also will see the authorizing statute at the bottom of the regulation. Sometimes, though, it'll have more than one authorizing statute. And sometimes they'll tell you the authorizing statute, and then they will tell you other statutes that it actually sort of touches upon or influences, and it'll list those statutes as well at the bottom.
So a regulation, like if you started your research with a regulation as one of your starting points, that's a great way to find the corresponding statutory law.
Yeah, it's a great way to find the corresponding statutory law, yeah, as well. And then sometimes too, like in Westlaw, you'll see that if you find the statute first, Westlaw will put the CFR section, all the CFR sections that sort of inform that statute. It'll put them in the citing references on Westlaw. Lexis actually does not do that. No, we love Lexis. No, we still love Lexis. No.
If it's all you got.
Yeah, and plus both of them will put the index to the Code of Federal Regulations online as well, because that's another way to kind of double check that you're locating all the statutes and the corresponding regulations. You can look up your topic within the index of the Code of Federal Regulations, because they also have a parallel table that will show you, that'll list the Code of Federal Regulations on one side, and then the corresponding statutes on the other side within those parallel tables in the back of the code.
Of the print code.
Of the print code, yeah.
Is it online?
Yeah, it's not online. No, it's not online. So yeah, you're going to need the print for that part.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll take a look at that along with our online sources. All right. Let's try and do that now.
Good to do the federal.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor Lenz.
You're welcome, Professor Shimjack. Thank you. We miss you guys.
We still miss you.
We really, really miss you.
Okay, Professor Lenz.
We're back.
I see we're starting at Westlaw to do our federal.
Because we love Westlaw.
Yes, we do. Okay, so what are we doing here?
I hate Lexis.
Stop it.
We are going to do federal. We're going to look for research federal regulations.
Okay, so I'm under the Federal Materials tab.
Yes.
And the two pieces that relate to regulatory research are the Federal Register, where the rules are first proposed, right?
Yep, first proposed, and then the final rule will be printed there.
And that's where you look for the findings and purpose.
Yep, you look for the findings and the purpose of the law, sort of like what you did with the session laws when you were doing the Hawaii research.
The legislative history?
The legislative history,
yeah. Okay. And then there is the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the home of the final rule.
Yeah, so after the final rule has been printed, it then has to be broken up by topic, just like your statutes. Just like the session law has to be broken up by topic. And it's dropped into the Code of Federal Regulations by these 50 different titles, which are all a different topic or subject.
Do the titles relate to the U.S. Code?
Sometimes, like actually, you'll notice there's some real similarity between the numbers in the Code of Federal Regulations and the U.S. Code, but you can't bank on it. Oftentimes they are different, so you just got to look at both of them closely and individually.
So the I see here in the tools and resources that we could use an index to access the federal regulations.
Yep,
right?
index is there. Yep.
So if you like to use indexes, you would click on that and use it as usual. I also like to point out the effective date, so that if you wanted to look at a regulation as it existed on a particular date, you could enter the date there and then see the regulation as it existed.
That's true.
Right? That's for the statutes as well. So that's really good for
that is true.
Your research, and instead of tracking through the legislative history,
right?
You could make use of this tool.
Right, because you have to argue for your client, at the time that the language, existed.
Right.
So you have to be cognizant of that.
Yeah. Okay, so what is our research today going to be about in the federal regulations?
Today we are actually going to be researching Irish potatoes. Now,
Irish potatoes?
I know.
Wow.
You would think there would be very few regulations on Irish potatoes, but there are actually many regulations. And that's very common. Your statutes are written very broadly, but your regulations come up behind them and fill in all the blanks and the details. So your regulations get very granular and can actually be more expansive and much longer than your statute. And Irish potatoes have a lot of regulations.
Yeah, and I like Irish potatoes.
I do not eat white food except for cauliflower, so I hate potatoes.
Okay. Since we're looking at importing Irish potatoes,
Importing Irish
right?
potatoes.
Yeah, because they have to come from Ireland, I assume.
You'd be surprised. Maybe
Really?
not.
Oh,
It might
okay.
just be a name.
Wow. All right, so I'm going to open up the regulation, and sort of like what I mentioned in the Hawaii regulations, I like it because I could see where I am.
Yeah.
So I'm in Title 7, Subtitle B, Chapter 9, and Part 980, because the CFR is organized by titles and then
Parts.
and then section.
And then
number,
sections,
right?
yeah, and that's a little bit different
Yeah.
than some other citations that you've done.
Yeah. So here it's like, it's Part 980, but sort of like the Hawaii Revised Statutes, it's also the section number.
Yeah, your citation combines the part and the section together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there are some similar features here just to review, right?
Yeah.
We have the table of contents,
Yeah, to give you the context for what you're looking at.
right? So
the
if we
section.
really were looking for hazelnuts or pistachios, I guess we could go to those parts. But
I like those. They're not white food. I like those.
You like the pistachios better, okay?
Lots of protein.
But we're sticking with Irish potatoes.
No protein.
But yummy. Okay, so here, just to give our students an idea of the level of detail that they'll find in a federal regulation.
Yeah, we'll scroll through it slowly.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
And
crazy.
Look at this. Irish potatoes are also grown in Colorado.
And they're grown in Washington State.
You mean I don't have to import them from Ireland?
No.
Oh, wow.
We are a global society.
I had no idea. And as we go through the regulation, I also noticed that pieces of the regulation will expire after a certain time.
Yeah, at certain times, and they'll note it for you in the regulation itself.
Mm-hmm. And the same is true on the other end. They might not come into effect
Right.
until a day in the future. So
Right.
that will also be noticed. You have to pay attention to those keys.
Yeah.
Those little keys that the federal government is giving you. What else do we need to know about looking at federal regulations on Westlaw?
When you're looking at the federal regulations on Westlaw, they often will give you these charts that we just went past.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of goes towards the discussion about the granularity about the regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Statutes generally don't provide details like fees or the cost of things.
Mm-hmm.
And here, and they definitely don't include tables and charts, but your regulations often include them
Mm-hmm.
in the language.
What about the citing references? We've looked at those for cases and for statutes,
Yeah.
and it looks like we have some results for regulations as well.
Yeah, in regulations too, you also have the citing references. You have 55 here, and then Westlaw has this other tab called context and analysis that kind of sequesters what they think are the references that give the most in-depth discussion
Mm-hmm.
of your resource. And one thing we have here that's sort of new and something we haven't seen before in this context and analysis tab is the Federal Register summaries. These are really helpful. So the Federal Register sections that affect the various code sections that you're looking at, they will drop them here in Westlaw within this tab, and they will drop down the summaries of them for you.
So you can get an idea of how the regulation develops.
Exactly. So you get an idea of how the regulation developed, what it looked like in the final rules
At different points.
at different points. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And if we wanted to see the full history of the regulation, we can go down to the bottom, right?
Just like the
a
statute.
So
Yeah.
history down here under credits.
Yeah. So this is unlike what we saw for the state regulations, but for the federal regulations, you can actually check out the credits, and you'll notice that the regulation has been amended several times since the first passage of the regulation in 1969. And you notice too that in the credits, it's not when we looked at the legislation for statutes, we saw that it gave you the public law number or the session law number if it was Hawaii. But notice here that they're giving you the date, but they're giving you the Federal Register number and the citation to it. So it's a little bit different in that way, but you can chart it the same way that you did legislative history.
And I see underneath the credits, there's also the enabling authority.
Yep. And then you have, just like we saw at the state level, federal level, you got to have the statute or statutes. Here we have multiple statutes that are actually authorizing the regulations.
Mm-hmm. So that's another way to do some more research if you're doing statutory and regulatory research.
Exactly. And when you do regulatory research, you really have to do statutory at the same time, and vice versa. If you're doing statutory research, you always have to do it. You need to do regulation research as well, because the statutes and the regulations really act as like a tag team when you're filling out and completing your rule block, and when you're looking for the cases that have cited to both of them to help you argue your rule.
So this regulation was very recently amended, just March 6, 2020.
Yeah, just a couple weeks ago, yeah.
But it's a really old regulation.
Yep.
So just for our students to point out, FR means Federal Register.
Yeah.
So these are the citations back to the Federal Register.
Yeah.
Why don't we take a look at that 1969 one?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do that. The 34 is the volume, and then the second group of numbers was the page.
Yeah, and they really do have thousands and thousands of pages.
Thousands of pages
in every volume.
Because it's published every day. It's published every day, so.
So you see there are several entries to the same page here, marked 1, 2, 3, 4. But you need to read what each of those pages are about. So this is just a correction. This has to do with limitations of handling. This one has to do
Determination
with
relative expenses.
rates of assessment. And this one has to do with Irish potatoes. So
that's the one we want.
That's the one we want, Irish potatoes. Okay, and it's what this was the final rule. Okay, so this is just a brief synopsis. And if you want to see that page, you would open up the PDF. And we're taken to this page.
And it's including all the pages.
Yeah, so see, these are all of the notices under Title VII, right? So this first one has to do with Valencia oranges, and then you have fresh peaches.
Fresh peaches in Georgia.
But we were interested in Part 980, the Irish potatoes, and that's the beginning of the rule. And if we turn to the next page,
it continues on,
and you could see that the findings and the reason why we have this rule is all laid out for you.
It's all laid out for you. So if you want the reason for the rule, the purpose of the rule, the thinking behind the passage of the rule, you would go to the federal regulation, because just like you learned yesterday, sometimes they don't include that information in the code of federal regulations, so you have to go to the register for that.
So for all of you policy wonks out there, you have to take a look at the Federal Register if you want to get all of that policy information and really track what the government is trying to do.
Yeah, and it's similar to what you already did for the legislative history and in the session laws, when you were looking at the session laws for that same information.
So it might be interesting for our students to see another instance of the Federal Register in Hein Online.
Yeah, Hein Online is more than just law reviews and journals. It will also give you the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations if you go to the Federal Register Library. And don't forget too, Hein Online also has all of the U.S. congressional documents that you would need as well. So it's really helpful beyond just law reviews and journals. It's very helpful for statute and regulation research.
So this year, we're in volume 85 of the Federal Register. What was the first year of the Federal Register?
I don't know. I know it's in the 30s. It started way back in the 30s, so 1936.
Let's see what the very first page of the very first Federal Register looked like.
What were they talking about? The very first regulation had to do with...
It's an executive order.
An executive order from...
Enlarging the...
Cape Romaine?
Migratory bird refuge in South Carolina. March 14th, 1936. So that would be what president?
FDR?
That's right,
I
FDR.
think, or Hoover, but where does he sign it? Is it at the second
next
page?
So executive orders are another type of administrative law.
Yeah, they're another type of administrative law. You'll find the executive orders, presidential orders, also presidential proclamations, and some presidential memorandum will also be published in the Federal Register.
Okay, so that's just another outlet to do that type of research. For those of you who are going on to do policy work, you'll probably want to learn a little bit more about this, maybe after your first year of law school.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more online tool we want to show you, and that's called regulations.gov. This is a free resource provided by the government, and we like it because it helps us keep track of what's going on at the federal agencies. So they always have a trending section. And remember, under the APA, agencies are required to provide notice of hearings and publicize proposed rules to collect comments. So this section here tells us what agencies have rules out there that are going to expire or expire soon for commenting. And notice some of them go out as far as 90 days. So, and some of them as of today.
Yeah.
So what's closing today? Right, so environmental assessments for the SpaceX Falcon launches. Are they harming those manatees?
Good question.
In Cocoa Beach.
I mean, there's got to be some sort of environmental impact.
Yeah, there must be.
If you're concerned, you can comment on it.
And very easy to do that.
Yeah.
We also see what newly posted regulations are out there. So these have just been published. And they're open for about a month.
You can filter them out.
Yeah, our filters are over here.
So
we're going to do a search for our Irish potatoes and show you the filters. Okay, so let me go back to the main page. And again, we're searching for Irish potatoes.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Okay, and we have 123.
123 mentions of Irish potatoes in the regulations.
In the regulations. Who knew there was so much to talk about with Irish potatoes? So here on our document types, you see the different filters. If you're looking for something that's open, and this was something that I had to keep track of as a new attorney, regulations and commenting period. So that was something I was keeping track of, and if something came up on behalf of our clients, I had to submit comments and write comments to federal and state agencies. It's not uncommon for new associates to do that type of work, right? And you could narrow by agency or filter by agency, and either rulemaking or non-rulemaking, because sometimes agencies are just issuing notices. It's not always going to be a rule. Probably what's most interest to you as a researcher is to filter out final rules from proposed rules or proposed rules from final rules. And it's just as easy as unclicking those boxes, so that now I only have 75 final rules that involve Irish potatoes.
That's crazy.
But I'm happy to learn that they can grow in Washington and in Colorado. So let's take a look at what these rules look like. Right? So it's giving you an action. This is an interim final rule. So it's not a proposed rule or a final rule. It's an interim rule, meaning at some point it'll be removed and there'll be a new final rule. They'll do this if they know they have a limited time period to act on something, or they only want it to be in effect for a certain amount of time. Although it's been in effect since 2005.
It's been a while.
Our government at work. Okay, and here's all of the supplementary information that goes into the rulemaking process, as well as the text. Quadrant of the circle of research.
which is one of the 4 starting points. You may start in one of the others and find yourself in regulations, or vice versa. If you are starting with regulations, you want to make sure you're in the right jurisdiction. You consult an annotated code, which at this point for Hawaii and for the federal regulations really is only Westlaw. Don't forget to read the helpful secondary authorities that West points you to, or that you find on your own, and you'll want to identify the relevant case law, both judicial and administrative. Even if the administrative is not precedential, it does represent the viewpoint of the agency, who does receive extreme deference from the judicial branch. Okay, so in Hawaii, really the best place to find your regulations is at the Lieutenant Governor's website. The Lieutenant Governor is required to maintain the agency rules, although each agency website is individual. So they're arranged slightly differently. You'll have to look for those regulations. And you'll also have notice of proposed rulemaking as well. The official publication that does that for us is the Government Register, which is only available on Lexis. And really that is the only reason you would go to Lexis to do any administrative work. The Hawaii Administrative Rules have 23 subject titles, and I'm giving you an example of how you would cite them according to the Blue Book rules. If we go over to federal regulations, remember that the initial location for proposed and final rules is the Federal Register, which is a daily publication. And it also contains executive orders and proclamations from the president, but we use it mainly to track our regulations. And it serves as the advanced service for the Code of Federal Regulations. And remember, for those of you looking for the history behind a regulation or the policy reasons, you'll need to look at the Federal Register entry in order to find that. The final resting place of a final rule is the Code of Federal Regulations, and that is organized according to 50 subject titles. And I'm giving you an example on the screen of how you cite to both the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, you'll often see the Federal Register shortened to FR, but the Blue Book citation requires FED period, REG period, bookmarked by the volume number and the page number. This is just a review of the Code of Federal Regulations, reminding you that it can be very complicated. It's a very heavy text. There are many volumes that are broken into parts and subparts and sections and subsections. Most important thing to remember about regulations, both federal and state, is that they cannot exist without a statute. So look for that statute and make sure you read the statute that's associated with the regulation and that you read the regulation that's associated with the statute. One of the most important things is that the regulation can give you more definitions, not just at the federal level, but also at the state. The publication pattern for the federal rules, they'll start out as a proposed rule in the Federal Register. This is under the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs the process for the most part. It'll be out there for a common period of 30 to 60 days. There'll be a notice of rulemaking, which includes the preamble or the findings and the reasoning behind the regulation. Sometimes it will go out for more than one public comment. If they have many substantial comments, they'll rewrite the rule and send it out for public comment again. And eventually it will end up in the Code of Federal Regulations. This is what the Federal Register looks like. So if you are looking at the Federal Register, whether it be on Westlaw, Lexis, or Hein Online, you'll see in this example the background to a proposed rule and the request for comments, the level of detail that goes into the rulemaking.
and it will eventually end up in the Federal Register as a final rule, noting both the title and the part number where you will find it in the CFR. So that is the review of administrative rulemaking for both Hawaii and for the federal government. And I hope you found it helpful, and it will inform you probably for the rest of your career. Okay, bye.